All right, so this session is production in the environment. It's a little eclectic in terms of the presentations that we'll be giving. We're going to start with Sandeep, and he is from the Indian Institute of Science, Education, and Research. So if you want to come on up, I will switch this over. Sandeep?
Thanks everyone for coming. So as you see, the title of my talk is Climate Change and Weather Variability in Crop Modeling, Evidence from the Rice Yield Trials in India using deep learning. So it's more of we use deep learning methods over here. And this is a joint work with my co-authors, Shriramji Singh, who is at Walmart, and Malidi, he is a previous student of mine. He was an undergrad student. Now he has recently joined financial consulting. So, as we understand that the climate change, the impact of climate change that has been on yield and production on agriculture, that is profound, and most of the times how the non-climate scientists who have treated climate change is like taking average of some weather variables and pretty much not taking into variability, the climate variability, the weather variability into account. But as the knowledge about or the idea of climate change that has spread among the non-scientists, non-climate scientists, that, well, the idea of climate change is not just changes in the average, but it's beyond the change in the mean. So it could be, as you can see, the figures I have over here, like this is taken from the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, which describes that climate change can be a shift in the mean, which is what most of us understand, but it could also be that the mean is preserved and you have an increased variability or changes in the symmetry of the climate distribution. So an extreme increased frequency of extreme event would be one of these later cases that's described in the picture. So what our research does is we used daily data. Ultimately, we compress into weekly data. But the idea is that the weather data that we take into account how it translates into changes in the yields, that is actually temporal. So it can preserve the temporal dependence of the weather variability that we have. So the data is time series, and so say a change in temperature or a change in rainfall followed by there's an increase in the rainfall, which is followed by a decrease in a similar amount of rainfall. On an average, it remains the same, but if just the sequence reverses, say that there is a decrease in the rainfall, but an increase followed by an increase, then those are two different sequence of weather realizations, and they can actually impact the yields. Okay, so that's what the idea we had. And well, we look at the rice production in India. So it's a major food crop, and almost more than half of the population, for them, it's the staple food. So what we use is we use experimental data, which are the agronomic fertilizer trial data. There has been a lot of work in the West that agriculture economists have used experimental data, but from if you look at the developing countries, there has not been a lot of collaboration between agronomists and economists to come up with more integrated models. So, and then finally we discuss okay, the exercise we are doing, what is a potential application of that? What could be a utility of that, of such a model? So, well, uh, just briefly describing the literature, primarily there are crop simulation models, which are typically developed by, has been developed by agronomists, and then there have been an increasing work on the statistical models that has been used. And as we know, like regression models have been a dominant approach that has been used for the modeling of climate and agriculture. But when we are taking a regression model, it's generally you use some summary of weather information. You can just can take the entire sequence of realizations that the random variable that we are taking, we either aggregate into some measure that can actually be taken into the regression model, because ultimately we have one independent variable, and then among, even if we can take multiple dependent variables, the observation has to be a one-to-one relationship. But over here, what we will see that we have taken, even with every observation, we have taken sequence of weather realization that has occurred through the growing period, and the current model that I'll be using the deep learning method, that is able to take that into account. So even if, say, in 2 different weeks, say, you just replace the, you just swap the weather values that has arose, well, in regression models, typically there may not be any change. But over here, because the sequence is changing, that can actually impact the yield and the yield forecast. So now, a little bit of literature on machine learning and deep learning approaches. So the different kind of data that have been used is either satellite imagery or county level yields, or you say agronomic experimental data that has been used. So we use the agronomic experimental data that comes from a long experimental trial from India. I'll go to that. And among the methods that have been used, typically which tries to take the weather variability in terms of the dynamic weather variability, if that has to be taken into account, LSTM or the long short memory technique, this has been a popular choice because this is able to preserve that temporal dependencies in weather variable realizations. Okay, so now our data, it comes from the All India Coordinated Research Project on Long-Term Fertilizer Experiments. This was conducted in 6 different locations in India. And if you look at the map, that's where these 6 locations are located. These are all in different agroclimatic regions. And the weather data we used is that comes from the Indian Meteorological Department. So you can see like the yield stations are marked by the black circles, and the closest weather stations that we have taken is the diamond shapes that you can see. So they are pretty much close to the yield weather station. And there were missing values, but for missing values, what we did is, instead of just averaging across the different weather stations, what we used is, for the particular weather variable station that we are interested, we took that weather station's variables as the dependent variable and all other weather stations close by as the independent variable, and using, instead of averaging, we try to predict it for the weather station that is of interest to us. So basically, it instead of averaging it, it tries to capture the co-movement of the weather variables between those particular weather stations. Now, our methodology, as I told, it comprises of the long short-term memory model. So these are kind of artificial neural network. So in artificial neural network, it's very similar to how our brain functions. That's in a sense, like, you know, there are different neurons and a bunch of neurons are connected to different other neurons, and that's how the signal is transmitted. So similarly, over here, in a very similar manner, oh, you have only 5 minutes? Wow. I wish there were like 10 minutes too in between. So, okay, so the basic idea is what it does is it carries all the information from the previous step, and it feeds that as an input, and this sequence of information as it goes down, it takes this into account, and the entire sequence of weather realizations that is fed into the system, so that which is actually used to make the final prediction. And well, these are more technical details. Yes. So yeah, this is just a flow of how an LSTM model looks like. But in addition, what we also do, we use an attention mechanism. Now, what does attention mechanism does? It is again very synonymous to like our brain. So we take, in order to process information, we take the most important information and not the entire sequence that we have, and that is basically is used to, so at the final stage, that goes to the attention layer, and that finally predicts the output. So this is helpful because one of the major criticism of the deep learning or machine learning methods is that, well, they don't have interpretability, but this helps in giving some understanding of, okay, which are the most important variables or probably the weeks. So these are the different predictive performance of our models. This is the results from, if we look at the results, our simple LSTM that performed one of the best, and compared to when we look at the linear regression models where we just had average summaries. And yeah, when we look at the attention models, these are the attention output from the attention. Well, in the 4th to 5th week, the week had the highest weight, which tells us is possibly that during that period of time, the weather information that arrived in the model, that's the most important. So it's giving some interpretability to the weather. And well, now in terms of policy implications, so this is an ongoing work, and this is what we plan to do over here. Well, in developing countries, there are no formal formal instruments for risk mitigation. And one of the, yep, I think I'm good now. So one of the ways that economists have proposed is using an index insurance, which is pretty much different from how an indemnity-based insurance works. So unlike an indemnity insurance, in an index insurance, the contract is built around an index, which is quantifiable, observable, and it cannot be influenced by the insuring. So the problems of moral hazard or say, high transaction costs, those all are pretty much minimized so that it becomes possible to offer an insurance product to the to farmers, to the farmers in the developing countries. However, one of the biggest problem with index insurance is that because it correlates to the index and not to the actual losses, there is this imperfect correlation between actually getting paid out when you face a loss. So that's called basis risk. And due to this, due to this imperfect correlation, the demand for index insurance is pretty low. There has been non-adoption, and that has been through many developing countries. And with that, it's important to improve the quality of the insurance product, so that if that can be done, maybe that will improve upon the demand for index insurance. So what our work can do, so in a recent work that was done in India, it was found that farmers' willingness to pay for index insurance was dependent upon the coverage period for like and typically in index insurance, what happens is, well, whatever the index is, I'll take one more minute.
1 minute.
Yeah. So with that, what happens is, for the irrespective of, so again, some summary measure of weather is used, and depending upon that, what the harvest has been, that determines. But there are weather fluctuations throughout the growing period. Now, because of that, weather fluctuation is not taken into the index insurance product. The weather fluctuations get pretty much ignored, and hence it's only on one particular weather value, or temperature or rainfall value. But what we suggest, that instead of that, if a sequence of weather variables, if that can be used as an index, and then which can be feed to these kind of models, then it will reflect it will be able to forecast yields more accurately, and certainly also the basis risk can be reduced. So maybe that is something what we plan to do in the future, to have it simulate the demand for agriculture insurance based on these models and traditional models. Thank you. So yeah, I'm open for questions. Yes.
So I'm sure I'm interpreting that one graph, that attention graph in slide 12. So does this imply then that it is that like 3 to 5 week window? It's whatever fluctuations are happening there is most important to final yield, or is that?
Possibly. So that's what we have currently. As I told, this is an ongoing work, and we have our preliminary results. Now, what we intend to do is, like, we would like to draw random realizations of weather, like weather realizations, and we would perturb it around this 3 to 4 weeks. And if we see that, yes, there are significant changes in yield predictions, that will help in further adding to the credibility of what we get over here.
Okay.
That's how I would see it. But I think, yeah, you are right. Yes.
Very short term shock that happened, like national rights research focused a lot about it. Will appear for relatively short period of time, every now and then we'll have like devastating effect on crop that you wouldn't have a lot of observation. As far as like the weather stuff, there would be a limited number of observations. So this for about two
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. So if we think about that, so say a flood-like thing or a drought-like thing, well, due to that, it's pretty much, it will be captured even without the LSTM models. And when we see the final output, that will be pretty much low in that case. But say it happens that, well, it's not a big enough shock to certainly cause a crop failure, but certainly it's has been in that direction, but not enough to lead to a crop failure. But there have been significant changes in the yields, like it has lowered the yields. So in that case, basically, well, standard models might not be able to predict, but with our model, because it will take temperature and weather, rainfall or other weather parameters, those fluctuations still will be able to predict that, okay, even if it has not gone to a devastating effect, we see that there are significant changes, lowering of yields. Okay. Okay, thanks all.
Yeah, no, actually, that issue with the unidirectional thing is something that I complain about all the time. in the
Oh,
sessions.
I'm glad to know that.
All right, you want to come on up? Let's see. Hopefully we get it open. All right. All right, so for our second speaker, we have Bin Yang,
Yes, perfect.
second year graduate student from Cornell.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to have all of you here today. Thank you so much again. And I'm Binyan Dai. I'm a second year PhD student at Cornell University in Applied Economics and Management. And the paper I'm presenting today is a decade later, change in economic and environmental outcomes for regional food system from 2007 to 2017. And we focus on the broccoli in the United States. So the first question I want all of us to think about, do you know where does the broccoli we consume every day come from? So I will show you the answer. So you can see from this map, so the broccoli in the United States, most of them are from West Coast. And from the USDA data, over 90% of broccoli are produced in California, which we are in today. And so California is definitely a dominant producer for the fresh broccoli in the United States. So this is the situation in the West Coast. Let's see what's going on in the East Coast. So starting around 10 years ago, 2010, USDA government, Cornell University, and other public and private sectors, they work together to develop an Eastern broccoli industry. They develop new broccoli varieties, which are appropriate for the weather and environment in the East Coast. And they want to build a reliable supply chain for the broccoli in the East Coast. And so given this effort from public and private, okay, sorry, I missed one slide. And I will show you how this total broccoli acreage changed in 2017 compared to 2007. And you can see in 2017, the total broccoli acreage increased 60% in 2017, and from around 8,000 to 13,000. And the total broccoli acreage in the West Coast, we can see the number is pretty large compared to the East Coast. And given this effort from the public and private sectors, and also the increasing consumer interest towards localization and local food, this local and regional food system has already become an important pillar for the US agriculture and the rural economic development. But their economic and environment effect of this growth is not well understood. Existing studies, they provide a thorough potential impact of expanding the alternative food systems and increasing local food supply. And there's one important paper for our work is the paper published in 2014 by Toller, and they found the increasing localization of fresh broccoli may reduce total supply chains and food miles. However, the policymakers and stakeholders still have little evidence on the exposed economic and environment outcomes of this food localization. So given this background, our research questions are, what have changed for the Eastern broccoli supply chain on its economic and environmental outcomes between 2007 and 2017? And what are policy implications of this change? To answer these questions, we employ a production transportation model of US fresh broccoli industry, and we calibrate to year 2017 and 2007 to assess this evolution of a regional food system. And more specifically, we measure the change in supply chain cost and food miles by season for the mainstream broccoli system and the Easter broccoli system. The mainstream broccoli system in our paper represents the broccoli we transported from the West Coast to the Easter market. And the Easter broccoli system represents the broccoli sourced in the Easter state to the local market. And we also measure the change in the market share of Easter grown broccoli in the US Easter market. And we plot the seasonal supply chain flows. And our work can inform food policies that can support and invest in regional food systems on their actual impact and evolution. And we can also inform the grower, packer, shippers who are interested in the information about the optimal magnitude, locations, and seasonality of product flows. And furthermore, tracking this evolution of regional food systems would also support more private and public discussions regarding the comparison between the conventional and regional food system. In the past years, there's several papers, they challenge the idea that the regional food system is sustainable. So, and come to our method. We use an optimization model, and the mathematical optimization model is advantageous to assess food supply chains. It can help us to identify optimal decisions regarding the production patterns and supply chains. And it also allows us to include spatial and temporal component in the model. For the data, we have 14 supply locations, California, Arizona, and we also include imports from Mexico and Canada and 10 other Eastern states. And because we focus on the Eastern market, and we have 33 demand nodes. And for the supply data, we have the yield, land acreage, production cost for each supply locations. And we calculate the seasonal demand by the per capita consumption and their population. And we also have the transportation data, distance, and the transportation cost. So, and the objective for this model is to minimize the total supply chain cost, which includes the total production cost and the transportation cost. We have several constraints, and which make the model more realistic, and I won't spend time on these details today. And so let's check how's the results. The first is the market share of the Easter grown broccoli. And we found in 2007, the market share for the Eastern grown broccoli in the Eastern market is around 12.5%. And in 2017, 10 years later, the market share increased less than 3% to 15%. And if you recall that paper I mentioned before, in that paper, they predicted the market share of Eastern grown broccoli in the Eastern market would increase by 60% when the Eastern broccoli acreage increased by 30%. And our results shows with the actual 60% increase of broccoli acreage in the Eastern regions, the market share actually increased less than 3%. And this is, I think it's still because the California is a dominant supplier for the broccoli in the Eastern market. And next, let's see how the change in the supply chain cost. And the left graph shows the annual average supply chain cost of mainstream sourced broccoli. And the right hand is the annual average supply chain cost for the Eastern grown broccoli. And in 2007, the supply chain cost of Eastern grown broccoli is higher than the mainstream broccoli. And this is because starting at that time, the broccoli, this new broccoli varieties in the Eastern state, they still have high production cost. And in 10 years later, both production and supply chain costs for mainstream or the Eastern grown increased. And again, we check the results in that paper. They projected the total supply chain cost actually would decrease in every scenario when they increase the broccoli acreage in the Eastern state. And our results actually shows the average supply chain cost of fresh broccoli in the Eastern market increased by 14% with this actual 60% increase of Eastern broccoli acreage. And this is the reason why we got different reason is because in our paper, the production cost and transportation costs increased in 2017. But in the Toller's paper, when they do the simulation, they assume the cost keep constant. So that's the reason why we got different results. And the next, let's see the environment outcomes, the food miles. If you are not familiar with this, the food miles in our paper, the definition is weighted average source distance traveled from different systems in the US Eastern market. And in the left hand is the food miles of mainstream sourced broccoli, which you can see in 2017, the miles from West Coast to the Eastern Coast is around 2,800 miles. And in the right hand is the food miles of Eastern sourced broccoli. It's in 2017, it's around 250 miles, which is much less than the food miles of mainstream stores. And we see the change here in the left hand, the food miles of mainstream sourced broccoli in 2017 increased. And this is because California in 2017, they're still a dominant supplier for the Eastern market. And for the miles of Eastern sourced broccoli in 2017, it decreased a little bit. This is because the reorganization product flows there, whereby Eastern produced broccoli, they substitute some of the mainstream produced broccoli in the Eastern states. So next, we display how this extension of localization affects the supply chain flows. And we show these maps, and we have the seasonal maps, and here is the spring season. And the left is 2007, and the right hand is 2017. And we can see there's more flows and more transported quantities in 2017. And we have more details about each demand location, about their change, for this supply chain flows in the paper. And then let's see the fall season. We can see the similar change. There's more flows, and you can, especially, for example, like North Carolina and New York State, they have more broccoli transported from the Eastern market. And so this is the optimal supply chain flows in these 2 years we displayed here. And so as a conclusion, in this paper, we employ a production transportation model of the US broccoli industry to analyze the change and evolution for a regional food system over the 10-year period. And our results found Eastern broccoli system performed as expected after 10 years with increased market share, supply chain cost advantage, and distance advantage. And this positive trend and increasing market size present opportunities for our existing and potential farmers and business and farm and food businesses to expand the regional food production. And furthermore, our model is generalizable, and other researchers can adopt this to evaluate and track other regional food systems, especially those involving fresh produce, largely produced in few regions, but consumed nationally. So that's all I have today. Thank you so much.
So as you were showing that map at the beginning, the transport maps, yeah, it got me thinking about weather risk in these different locations. I don't know anything about broccoli. Okay, looks like you also do.
Yes. Thank you for that question. Actually, I have another paper tomorrow. I'll present how the weather would affect these supply chains. Broccoli.
Okay. Can you tease it for me then?
I hope you can come tomorrow. Yeah, so actually because over 90% of broccoli are produced in California. Yeah. And we are in California now. We can see the weather is pretty hot, and especially the extreme weather here, the drought. And the broccoli is a water intensive crop. So we are thinking, if the drought here increase more, how it can affect the production of the broccoli, especially in California. And if California reduce its production and transship to the Eastern market, where should we produce in the Eastern states? That's another paper I'm presenting.
Well, so my intuition actually would work the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I assume broccoli is a pretty high value crop.
Yes.
Most of that production in California is going to be irrigated,
Mm-hmm,
and depending on water rights in certain, those regions, it's probably a pretty standard like water supply.
mm-hmm.
It really depends on like how your water rights are here, but otherwise, you don't face that much weather constraint. It's really hot, but you just put more water on it, and it's really good. That's why they grow so many vegetables in California. I don't know what the other side of weather risk would look like in the East Coast, like rainstorms or hailstorms, or
I see.
what types of things. So just something to think about.
That's a-
I
that's a-
don't know enough about broccoli.
That's a great question. That's a great question. I'll think about how the weather doing in the East Coast, and I'll see how this change.
What's a shock?
Yes, that shocks. Thanks for a question.
I think it's a risk to grow broccoli in any of the in the East Coast. It's more yields of marketable product of high quality. It's going to be more valuable.
Thank you.
I have a question about the new variety, the characteristics of that. In terms of it helping manage the new risk, where, what are the attributes of the new variety relative forward?
The new broccoli varieties in the East Coast.
Isn't that what they introduced?
Yes.
So what is the new variety like with the old variety?
I think the new varieties are more because in the East Coast, in the winter, the weather is very cold, and the water, the soil, and everything is different with the broccoli we have in the California, and they need to have the new varieties. And I'll definitely go check the new varieties, what attributes they have, but so far I don't have the answer.
They are more long days, good nights, and hot days. The new varieties can be of the same quality, but without a big difference in day and night, and not much sunlight. And that's when North Carolina has the soil. So by so that in the Northeast, but I think that the well unique conditions,
Thank you, Miguel.
Fine, good question. That seems relevant right now. And you clearly did since 2017 when transportation costs were quite a bit lower than they are now. And so I had a question first on how you parameterize those. I know you have the distance, and you said the AMS there, and how you parameterize the transportation cost and how these results will change under 2022 gas prices, energy costs. We thought about sort of presenting that as a also risk mitigation to the miles transported without precipitously.
Yes, for the transportation data, we calculate based on their truck rate, because the most broccoli are transported by the truck. So we check the data about the truck rate, and for each demand location and supply location, we calculate that we found the truck rate in each state, and this calculates their distance and it calculates the unit for transportation cost. Thank you.
Any questions?
Hi,
Great, thank you.
can you hear me? Sorry, I'm speaking through Zoom. Can you hear my question? No, can anyone hear me?
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, I know. It's something I never do it that way.
Hello?
All right, next we have Douglas Becker. He's currently a postdoc at the University of Idaho. Take it away, Douglas.
Okay, awesome. I don't even have to introduce myself. Thank you. I am, all right, I can skip that part. I have two of my co-authors here, so hopefully they can keep me honest and make sure I didn't make up too much of this. What button does next? Oh, you have to click. Too far. This is interesting. Okay, so I thought I'd kick things off here with the introduction. This is very sensitive. There we go. Okay, so what is the Conservation Reserve Program? It is the U.S. Department of Agriculture operated program that pays farmers to implement agricultural conservation practices, mostly through things like decommissioned farmland or vegetative windbreaks, riparian buffers, buffer strips, grass strips, and some significant and well-known benefits of the Conservation Reserve Program that have been documented time and again in studies is decreased soil erosion, unsurprisingly, and topsoil loss, improved water quality, and restored wildlife habitat and expanded biodiversity. It is skipping. Sorry, this is exceedingly sensitive. So not surprisingly, agriculture generates air pollution, harmful air pollution. It's mostly as a result of fossil fuels and the application of artificial fertilizers that then degrade on the ground or in the water and then vaporize and react atmospherically. And in many cases, that atmospheric reaction creates the well-known hazardous air pollutants, ozone, and particulate matter. Not surprisingly, this air pollution then translates into health impacts, both morbidity and mortality. And this comes as a result of primary and secondary pollutants. Not surprisingly, in this case, in this study, we're going to be focusing on secondary pollutants, namely fine particulate matter, because of the wealth of data availability around that and its well-documented health effects. No conversation, no study about agricultural air pollution would be complete without drought and precipitation sensitivity has a big impact on pretty much every stage of the process of the generation of air pollution. Drier ground and hotter air means more evaporation and degradation of fertilizers and more atmospheric reactivity, generating more harmful secondary pollutants. And in our formulation, we hypothesize that a lack of conserved land, a lack of the CRP would lead to the generation of more secondary air pollutants, especially fine particulate matter. So the study objectives here, not surprisingly, are to determine what the effect on air pollution concentrations, fine particulate matter concentrations in our case, is of CRP. Determine what the effect that drought has on those PM concentrations and how those things interact. And then finally, extend those results to quantifying mortality and the associated economic value of that mortality. So how do we do it? The study design, our spatial unit of analysis is the county. temporal unit was the month, and this gives us the entire study area of the lower or contiguous United States and a study period of 2001 to 2016 complying with overlapping data availability. So our ultimate study sample size is 439,000 observations on 2,300 counties. Our variables here, and I didn't write out my formula, so hopefully the economics police don't get wind of this, but you could follow along with the variables here. Our DV, like I've mentioned, is fine particulate matter concentrations, and we got these concentrations from the joint EPA, CDC modeled and satellite calibrated data. And our two independent variables of interest are the percentage of arable land acreage that is enrolled in the conservation reserve program. And to capture drought, we use the Palmer Drought Sensitivity Index, which ranges from -8, the driest conditions, to 8, a +8, or the wettest conditions. And this is sourced from the meteorological and climatological modeling system GridMed. And then we also controlled for county population, uses a proxy or a representative of county urbanization, development, and then also acres of wildfire burn, because like drought, wildfire plays into pretty much anything air quality, especially agricultural air quality related. Our analytical process was standard, no surprises here. Do descriptive statistics to see what the preliminary relationship looks like, then perform basic statistical modeling, OLS, no surprise, and run model diagnostics to see what kind of more advanced modeling needs to be done, and then run the advanced modeling itself. In this case, we used a fixed effects model with fixed effects on county, year, and month to account for unobserved variables, unsurprisingly, and the variability in those parameters. And then we ran a sensitivity analysis to test model robustness. So standard analytical playbook. And then to extend our PM results to the mortality and economic value, we estimated all-cause mortality with a mortality function derived from literature, actually one that has been used in the global burden of disease assessment, and multiplied those mortality estimates by the value of a statistical life derived from my meta-analysis of studies on the value of a statistical life. And we did this for 3 different scenarios to kind of illustrate the maximum impact of the presence or the lack of, for instance, CRP. And our first primary scenario was what would happen to particulate matter concentrations across the United States if all CRP was removed. The second one was simulating an increased drought by just subtracting 4 from the Palmer Drought Sensitivity Index, and then we did a combined scenario of both. So in this simple and descriptive statistics from this nice hand-drawn illustration here, we see that we kind of have a slight but noticeable interaction or association going on between the PM 2.5 concentrations and CRP, and an even slighter, hard to detect one between PM 2.5 and PDSI, but they are existent. And then in our model results, I have taken the liberty of highlighting in yellow our main model results in case you couldn't pick that out for the fixed effects. And we do observe a small but statistically significant and negative association between CRP enrollment and fine particulate matter concentrations, as well as a small but significant and negative association between PDSI and fine particulate matter concentrations. However, I will point out at this point that virtually everything is statistically significant here due to our large sample size. So I think the salient factor here is the magnitude and the direction of the relationship. So moving on to our counterfactual scenarios. This is a map of what would happen to fine particulate matter concentrations in the United States in the high enrollment year of 2008 if all of the CRP disappeared. And the darker the color, the bigger the, I guess, increase in CRP if it was removed. So the Southeast, the High Plains, and surprisingly, the Northwest would see the largest increases in fine particulate matter concentrations. And then, of course, we used that change in that year to project mortality associated with that, as well as the scenario where PDSI was decreased to simulate drought, and the combined scenario, and then multiply that times the meta-analysis derived value of a statistical life, which was just $7 million, to see that there's some, it's not a massive amount, it's about 0.5% of all mortality, but there are a potential projected 1,300 to 3,000 deaths in what I would consider the worst case scenario. So what does all of this mean? Like you saw in the results, there is a small and significant and negative relationship between CRP acreage enrolled and fine particulate matter concentration levels. Based on our projections, there could be a 1,300 to 3,000 range of deaths avoided in the worst case scenarios. And since CRP costs the federal government about $2 billion a year, it pays for itself maybe even multiple times over via the avoided mortality just from a reduction in fine particulate matter levels, which could be as much as $21 billion. So policy implications, I just went over that first one. CRP is amazingly efficient, and that's just in terms of avoided fine particulate matter. We can add that to the long list of CRP's benefits, especially the reduced topsoil and improved water quality. So we can speculate that CRP might also contribute to improved air quality. And for future research directions, we plan and we hope to do research with smaller units than the county, because counties can be huge. So we'd like to drill down more into that relationship and do a smaller temporal unit than the month. So spatially and temporally, we could make this a stronger piece of research in the future by using smaller units. And also it would be beneficial to look at individual species of PM, fine PM, which we were not able to do, and different air pollutants, especially if we're sticking in the vein of secondary air pollutants, look at perhaps ozone. Acknowledgements, my two collaborators here, Alex and Jude, as well as James Crooks. And that is it. Thank you.
Question, yeah.
That's interesting, but I had a couple of clarifications. One of those is, so As far as I understand, I may be wrong, CRP is primarily is air pollution one of the mandates? Like beyond the CRP like I know it's there for the water pollution. That's the primary one of the things and
Right, and topsoil loss,
conservation,
yeah.
That's what we done. So does the CRP specifically mentions about air pollution too?
I don't believe so. I think actually, if I had more than the 20 minutes here, I could have gone into the literature, but it's actually only really recently been looked into
Yeah.
that there might even be a relationship between CRP and air pollution. So I can't say for certain, but I don't think that it's a stated goal.
Another reason why I was asking, like, I'm not even familiar with the literature with air pollution and CRP. Like if you, as you are saying, if recently there has been some, could be, I would be interested in looking at that.
There isn't much.
There isn't much.
There isn't much. Yeah, there might be 2 or 3 studies that are specifically about CRP and air quality, and I think only one of them is even mechanistic.
Second clarification I would have about this, like, I think you mentioned that going to be future research because counties can be large and there could be spatial correlations and temporal correlations, all those are related to that. So for your current research, what so the variable you use, which is the PM, the particulate matter, that you take from what is the data they use for at the county level, because you would be using county level PM concentrations.
In future research,
I mean, currently what are you using?
currently, yes, it's county daily PM concentrations that are from a joint modeled satellite fine particulate matter data set that's done by a joint EPA CDC project.
So that's basic because this would be at some station level which measures air quality, which would be across the county. So you are using some model to you get the county level air particulate matter.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions?
One about the index. Process the index that is not controlled with that measure that.
I'm not sure I understand.
So it is a measure. Yeah. But we're averaging.
Yes, it comes as daily data, but we averaged it weekly, yeah.
I have one more follow-up question, if you allow, Alex.
Yeah, we got a minute left.
Okay, yeah.
CRP variable you are measuring, is it the number of enrollments in every county? How is it, what does this variable look like?
Yeah, sorry, I I kind of went through that really quickly because again of the 15-minute thing, but it is the percentage of arable land in the county that is enrolled in CRP.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Yeah, so that was actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think like it would be, how are you using that? The percentage?
The percentage of people.
Yeah, because if we just used raw acreage, then it could be a tiny county that's
Yeah.
that's all CRP or a huge one that has 1 acre. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Look at that, we stayed on time. Oopsies. Hopefully that works. All right. I'm the last presentation, and I'm Alex Moss from the University of Idaho. This is a project that's actually funded by an SCRI grant. And as is the case in Idaho, you are mandated to be on potato projects. So what we're looking at is an exploration of preferences for soil health practices. Chris McIntosh and Patrick are also a part of this group, and Kate Fuller from Montana State. And why? The so what question is actually really easy here. The potato industry is huge. It accounts for 15% of all vegetable farm sales receipts in the United States. It's about $4 billion in farm gate value. And sort of more humanistically, it's the third most important food crop for direct human consumption worldwide. So potatoes matter. That's why they're on our license plate. Potatoes also, they have yield premium on premium acres. The yield gains by potatoes are unseen in any other field crop and most vegetables. Unfortunately, what goes along with that is the fact that it's an intensive production practice that severely affects soil health. They're very input intensive. So while potatoes have an incredibly high return, they also have a lot of input costs. What we're interested specifically is how soil health can potentially affect those things and the other on-farm and off-farm ecosystem functions like carbon sequestration, runoff, that kind of thing. Potatoes are uniquely susceptible to pathogens. So to the extent that we can create a healthy microbiome to reduce those pathogens, we can save money, reduce inputs. It's a sort of win-win solution. And so what was this part of the project? This is a very large project. We're just one sort of very small part of it. We're trying to characterize potato farms and potato farmers. That includes things like how big are these operations? What are the rotations they do? How familiar are they with soil health practices? And I put that in quotes because we're still trying to figure out what that means. If anyone knows an answer, I'd love to hear it. And we use a discrete choice experiment as part of this survey to see if there's sort of underlying preferences around characteristics that either farmers are amenable to or sort of naturally resistant to. But really, that part of the project is to say, hey, what should we be researching? And will farmers adopt it? There's the idea that without knowledge, action is useless, and knowledge without action is futile, right? If we're researching the wrong thing and a farmer's never going to implement it, well, then what are we doing with our time and money? So what are the methods here? We conducted in-person surveys. In fact, the Potato Expo was in Anaheim in January, so I'm super excited to be back. And we used email blasts through things like Spudman. We still have to do quite a few more of these. Unfortunately, COVID happened at a time that was very inopportune for us. I mean, everyone, but particularly for this project. So we're only about halfway through the sample size that we need. So everything here is very preliminary. For our online participants, we entered them into a $50 gift card raffle. And for our in-person, when we went to Potato Expo and some other places, we just gave everyone $20 gift cards for participating. We started in the winter of 2020. Like I said, COVID was not great for us. And we're still doing this because we're trying to make up for the last 2 years. And so as part of this survey, what are we collecting? We're collecting things like location, the size of the operation, leasing arrangements, end markets, rotation, soil practices, so on and so forth. This is a bit problematic from an actual analysis side, from our side as economists, because this project is across many states, from Maine to Idaho to Minnesota, Colorado, and all of these places have very different practices and very different sort of farm characteristics. So we're trying to collect them, and to the extent that we can, geolocate them. as part of the discrete choice experiment, again, because we have such variety, it was very difficult to parameterize this. So unlike past choice experiments that I've done where sort of you have percent changes and you can be very specific about a 3% increase in risk or something, we left these very open-ended so that hopefully farmers can sort of do that fixed effect in their own mind, right, and adjust for their operation in their location. And the things we specifically looked at were what is the effect on pest management, fertilizer requirements, irrigation, level of work and inconvenience, and then an average change to the annual per acre profit or net returns above operating cost. And so those, for those of you who know how discrete choice experiments work, they look something like this, where you're presented with options and a status quo. You need a status quo. There's been a lot of research around that. I don't need to spend time on it, but to get unbiased estimates, you need to give someone a real choice set, and a part of that choice set is doing nothing. And so you'll see option 1 and option 2, and based on the underlying attributes, you pick the option that you prefer. Now, much like Doug said, I'm not going to present all of these equations. Ultimately, we're going to use the mixed multinomial logit model. We sort of dropped the mixed part of that out because we don't have enough respondents yet to break this up into farmer types. So we're doing a more basic analysis at the moment. All of this is actually rooted. The theory comes from random utility theory. You can read McFadden if you want to learn more about that. And so far, we have about 130 participants. But they were allowed to omit questions. So every question you see does not mean you have 130 respondents. What are our results so far? Well, farms are vastly different sizes. The average acres, and I should also say some of this hasn't been cleaned appropriately. So I know that that mean is skewing very high because there's some numbers in there that I'm not sure I quite believe. But the operations are huge, vastly different sizes. We have 46% of farms saying they have fresh pack as an end market, 43 as processing, and 27% gained some amount of income from off farm. We have rotation lengths. 3 is by far the most common rotation length. The 2 and 4, are somewhere in there. Soil practices, well, almost everyone's using conventional fertilizer, no surprise there. Inoculates was higher than I expected. I think that's potato growers are generally ahead of the curve on a lot of that, input intensive technologies. So that's what we have for sort of summary farm statistics. Now that we have those, we can say, well, this is very much a convenience sample. It's people that we were willing to talk to us at Potato Expo, and it's people that were willing to respond to those surveys. So is there a way we can use this information to actually validate that our work is at least somewhat representative of the field? So what we did, and thanks to Ken Frost for doing this, is actually looking at cropscape data from 2008 to 2020 and looking at every field location and then seeing what it became year after year after year. So at least in terms of our responses, they're pretty fairly in line with what we're getting here. I will say we know from our zip codes that we're skewing heavily to the west and we're overrepresenting the fresh pack market currently. But outside of that, so I mean, some of these results are at least encouraging. Those are the average rotation lengths, which line up with our own. We can break that down a little bit further into sort of the specific rotation lengths, and I'm not going to present all of this, but our surveys sort of line up actually with what we're observing in real life through cropscape data, and that's somewhat encouraging. Percent of growers who lease land. A lot of farmers are leasing land. The amount conditional on leasing land, it's about 50% of acreage grown is leased. The average length of that lease is 5.8 years. Why do we care so much about leasing land? Well, if we're talking about soil health practices, those don't just happen overnight, right? You have to build up healthy soils. And if you're on a short-term lease, if you're on a 2-year lease, why would you care, right? It's a Sherman march. You might as well just burn it to the ground. So it's part of the things we're trying to extract out of this. The potato statistical yearbook does have a lot of information in it, but some information that we needed is just not in that information set. So very few leases, although more than I still expected, have some stipulation for soil health. Unfortunately, we let the farmer sort of read into that what they want. So how they're defining that practice, we don't really know. We also ask about barriers to adoption. No surprise here. It's the same thing we see every time we ask these questions. Uncertainty in short-term economic benefits, most common. Uncertainty in long-term economic benefits is the second most common. And then capital constraints. Something that we didn't actually think about on the front side is that new practice is incompatible with the current system. And when we did a little bit of digging into that, a lot of times it was really just the length of the growing season isn't long enough to do cover crops and that kind of thing. So we have all this sort of farm characteristics, how people feel about soil health, and then we have the choice experiment. And like I said, currently we don't have the sample size to start parsing this out into types of farmers and see where that is sort of differentiating between operation types. But we do have a few things that we know matters. First, the good news is, if you look at the sort of utility scores behind this, the price or the net returns is by far the most influential factor. That's a good sign. It means people are acting rationally as business owners. The only problem there is it's such a strong signal that it makes me worry that the results might be problematic because people are just focusing on whatever has the highest return. Reducing pest threats. So if the way you can interpret these coefficients is not well, let's look at the statistical significance star, and then they're translated to willingness to pay, where you can think about willingness to pay as what the additional return would need to be for you to adopt a hypothetical practice that required those things. So if your practice was going to reduce pest threats, you actually would be willing to give up $25, right? Curiously though, increased pest threat is insignificant. So we'll come back to that in a minute. Increased fertilizer requirements. Fertilizer is very expensive. So net returns. The problem there is it's hard to tell the respondents were actually conflating these two things, right? So in the text we give them, it says, total operating costs separate from these things. So hopefully they were taking that into account, but both irrigation and fertilizer are very large numbers. So that's what we have so far. And why do we care about this? Well, any practice that increases irrigation and fertilizer requirements is probably a non-starter unless it has a very high return associated with it, right? And that's probably largely because we're skewing west. And if you're in the west and you have the doctrine of prior appropriation, you really can't go out and get more water very easily. So clearly that's going to be a huge problem for you. Farmers are appropriately focused on net returns. What this tells me about future agronomic research is let's just focus on the things that increase returns and then they'll get adopted. It's the same thing they said about the Impossible Burger, right? If you make it taste good, people will start buying it. If you don't do that, it doesn't really matter if you tell them you should. Rotation lengths are still very short. We're still getting 2 and 3 years. Anecdotally, as I was traveling around, people were talking about all the long rotation years that still exist. This doesn't seem to be the case, both in the stated responses and in the observed data. So that's a bit of a letdown, I guess, if that's your goal. But if your goal is to maximize net returns, then of course you want shorter rotation lengths because potatoes have such a high return compared to anything else you're going to grow. And additional work and education requirements do not appear to be significant at all. If you go back, all the stuff in here in terms of you train more or do increased soil testing, people don't seem to respond to it. They don't really care. I guess they're willing to do the work if it has the return. And I will say that we are sort of ignoring cognitive limitations there. There might be some education that's just a little too advanced. And so what's next? Like I said, we're only halfway through actually collecting this sample. So we're going to increase our sample size. We're going to use this work for preliminary data for our next SCRI grant. And once we get a larger sample, we're going to start trying to parse this out into types of farmers and see if there's real heterogeneity based on characteristics of the farm. And I think it gets me to 15 minutes. So thanks and questions.
Sure. Yeah, actually, I have for not for this project, but I am familiar with them, and there's a chance that we will switch over to some sort of late class stuff. Actually, Jamie's show and this logic only need so I think this is possible to show.
Yeah, I agree with you. I haven't done much in terms of parsing out those groups because we just don't have the full sample yet. Didn't seem. They may not be once you actually separate them, but I haven't tried. And I like the latent class model because you don't need you're not setting anything up a priori. You know, you can let it find them for you, and that would be very nice if that's what we find. Yep.
Is there anything inherently specific about potatoes, like to your core question, sort of adoption? Other than your obligated labor.
But specialty crop grants? I would say yes, they are. So think about no-till operations, right? You want to try to do that in potatoes? It's not going to work. If you,
I mean, are you asking about specific practices? I thought you were just
we are there. Yeah, there's much more in that survey than what we just presented here.
Okay.
But also they have much higher returns, and you have to do rotations in a very specific way because they're so, because pathogens are such a large concern.
You are limited by, you need to ask.
Yeah, we were specifically asking, but
Like expand your sample size.
yeah, so we are only asking potato farmers. In fact, one of the things Chris might have a better gauge of this, but I'm worried that by the time we get to the sample that we need for the power of basic, it's going to be a census. It's no longer going to be a sample.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Special about potatoes is there are susceptible. When you just got soil, vector infections, you've got seed vector infections, insect vector infections. And so anything you can do in the process to cut down on the loss. They have viruses, they have bacteria, they have everything.
Nematodes.
Oh, you know, the average potato.
Oh, well, also what they have is, if you look at an enterprise budget for potatoes, both the input cost and the net returns are much larger than you're going to see on any other field crop.
Yeah.
I mean,
$9.
Yeah, our crop budgets are a bit outdated now, but it's 1,400 cost per acre, right? Something like that. That's a very expensive thing to grow. So. Sure.
When you show the sample for your DC, there was some 170. Something you mentioned. Probably, I think I have missed something. That's why this question.
Oh, sure. So
yeah,
I blew through a lot of that. So with these models, I actually thank you. That's something I need to include in this. When you ask this question, every person sees this question multiple times, and it's randomly generated the options they get. So that number is actually, you could divide that by 6 to get the actual observations, maybe more than 6 actually. And then when you actually do it, those are all sets of 3. So this question everyone sees 6 times, and then they are getting 3 options there. So those observations are not actually number of respondents at all. They're many higher.
So maybe I understood it wrong. So these option 1 and option 2 are not fixed. So like what I understand is probably you're randomizing across these options and showing them.
No, we're randomizing every attribute.
Every attribute, yeah, that's what I was, and so you did also this for some of them in person.
Yep.
How was it done?
Tablet that can randomly generate and fill in as they go. Yeah.
The last one was based,
So this is just that's what. So if you were taking this in person, you'd get a text around what we're trying to get you to think about, and then you would see this option. You would look at option 1 and option 2, and you'd say, you know what, I'm going to increase my threat of pest if it's going to give me $100, and you click this option. And then you'll see this exact thing again, but these will be filled in with different options.
different, okay, so this is a screenshot.
It's a sample. It's a sample. I actually just went into this assuming that people are familiar with DCEs, and I realize now I could have put some more work into explaining what they are. But I think that wraps up our session. If there's no more questions.